Brandenburg School of Communication and the Department of Sociology, the University of Pennsylvania. He's also a member of the Center for Studying Contemporary China and the Center for East Asian Studies. His research areas cover digital media, digital communication, global communication, social movements, cultural sociology, and the sociology of China. He spent the last 15 years studying how Chinese citizens harness social networking and the internet as tools for civic activism. He's the author of 2 books, The Red Guard Generation and Political Activism in China, which is forthcoming from Columbia University Press, and The Power of the Internet in China, Citizen Activism Online, also from Columbia University Press, which was the winner of the Best Book Award for Communication and Information Technologies. He is also the editor of 3 volumes, China's Contested Internet, The Internet, Social Media and Changing China, and Re-envisioning the Chinese Revolution, the Politics and Poetics of Collective Memories in Reformed China. And numerous articles, some of the most important topics facing us today, ranging from how emotional processes affect mobilization online, to online activism as compared to various protest movements, cyber politics, memories of the Cultural Revolution, and the question of hegemony, the rise of Chinese transnational fear, and the question of food safety. Today he's going to speak about regulating the Chinese internet in the name of civility. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yin.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank Professor Chen especially and for inviting me to this wonderful occasion. It's a great pleasure. It's also sort of the right moment for me because for many years I've been working on the internet activism in China, but relatively recently I decided to take a closer look at the other side of the picture, the government, and how government regulates and manages the internet. So I've been working on a couple of papers, and today's talk is based on one of these working papers. It's sort of in a very rough shape, and that's why it's a good time for me to get some responses and feedback. Okay, so this is the topic today, regulating the internet in China in the name of civility. And the discourse of civility is not unique to China. It's actually a prevalent discourse in the United States, right here, right now. But since when this article on the left-hand side from New York Times, that was 1997. An op-ed was already lamenting the decline of civility in politics, gone from the left, and then from the right, literally and intellectually and socially. Rush Limbaugh has this quite intriguing and interesting interview on his radio show, where he claims that civility is the new censorship, that the left is using civility to hush up us. And this, so this discourse is also quite prevalent and ongoing debate about civility in the United States right here. There are a lot of projects about civility. This one on the left is Rutgers project called Project Civility. And on this project website, it says this 2-year dialogue, not just about matters, aims to cultivate passion, compassion, courtesy. So there are projects in educational institutions to cultivate civility. And then there are also recently published article in the First Amendment Studies, where in this case, for instance, again, the civility is critiqued as a kind of threat to academic freedom. This ongoing debate and discourse about civility in contemporary American society. In China, the discourse of civility and civilization has also been very common and increasingly common. This, on the right hand, the character is literally means civilization. And this is a publication, an online publication produced by the China Center in the National Australian University. They published the China Star Yearbook for a number of years. For 2013, civilization civility was the keyword for the entire yearbook of that year, just showing that in 2013, suddenly civilization, the discourse of civilization took on some special significance. And I'll explain why later on, why 2013 seems to be an interesting turning point. In order to understand the relevance and significance of this discourse of civility and civilization, we need to understand a little bit. I'm sure you understand, you know a lot about the Chinese internet and web spaces, but I want to emphasize a few points just to sort of lay the groundwork for our analysis. I want to emphasize 3 points, well, 4 points actually. First is main argument in my book in 2009, The Power of the Internet, is an argument about how Chinese web and Chinese internet is a critically contentious space. It's full of critical voices, very contentious space. So activism, protest, dirty language as well. The second point is that it's also a messy space. If you have visited big Chinese cities and visited the popular tourist places, you know the Chinese streets are messy streets, right? It's crowded and but interesting, fascinating sometimes. Good restaurants, but could also be dirty. It's messy. Especially if you compare nowadays, the websites are becoming more and more civilized. But years back, if you look at the websites, Chinese popular websites, they are as messy as Chinese streets. In interesting ways. Sometimes in interesting ways, sometimes it's dirty. But it's messy, and that's an interesting feature, I think, of the Chinese internet. In the language of civility that is increasingly used to govern the Chinese internet space, the language of vulgarity has been used quite often to describe the Chinese internet. That because it's messy, it actually has a lot of vulgar stuff. Dirty language, rumors, false information. So it's also vulgar from the point of view of the regulators. That's why I put it in quotation marks. It's from a particular perspective. Because of these features, that is contentious, it's messy, and it's vulgar, the government from the very beginning meaning the mid-1990s, has been conscientiously trying to regulate the internet. So numerous policies, regulations from all kinds of departments, all kinds of ministries, Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Education, certainly Ministry of Information Technology, Public Security, State Council, all government agencies have their policies about a particular aspect of the internet. So we've had numerous policies aimed at regulating the internet, how people can, what kind of things people can say and so on. But what I say here is that many regulations are only half successes, not entirely successful, that Chinese internet continues to be contentious and messy and vulgar despite all these kind of regulations and despite all these efforts and resources and money and personnel invested in the governing of the Chinese cyberspace. On the right hand, if you Google the Grassnut Horse lexicon, this lexicon is created, maintained by a website in Berkeley, a group of researchers. called China Digital Times. It's a fascinating lexicon of the new kind of language, a lot of dirty and vulgar language that is coined online by Chinese internet users or netizens, often to make fun of government policies. So the Grossmanhaus itself is a very dirty word in Chinese. So it's a very interesting kind of lexicon to study. It shows the change that has taken place, and it shows how people in everyday life, in everyday language, creates new language in order to deal with censorship and government control. So government has been trying very hard to regulate with half successes, but there are some new trends since 2013. That's why 2013 seems to be an interesting turning point, and that's a keyword for 2013 in the China Star Yearbook was civility, civilization, some new trends. According to People's Daily online surveys in recent years, since about 2013, the number of protest events online has declined. At the same time, the number of online incidents, or news incidents, online incidents with positive energy has increased, and the number of online incidents with negative energy has decreased. So throughout this talk, I might introduce a number of relatively strange vocabulary. And this positive energy and negative energy are two of them. But they're not strange. They are actually now very common part of the mainstream discourse in China. Positive energy basically means online discourse that is supportive of government policies and agendas. And negative energy is anything that's critical, that's vulgar, that's messy, that's bad. So part of the recent government agenda is to promote online discourse that can generate positive energy and try to crack down on discourse that generates negative, critical energy. So these are some of the new trends that have been happening since 2013. 2013 was a turning point because it was really the first year when the current new leadership came to power. President Xi Jinping took office at the end of 2012. So started. So basically, all these changes have to do with a new leadership and new policies that have been implemented in the governance of Chinese society broadly and Chinese internet more specifically. So these new trends, my main sort of task today is try to offer explanation of why, after so many years of a contentious web, Chinese website seems to be now, at least for the time being, harnessed. That is, it's not as contentious as before, at least on the surface. My main argument is that it is because of this deployment of a new discourse of civilization and civility for the purpose of governing the internet. So I'm going to have to explain, go over some of the ideas of civility and the history of the discourse of civility and civilization in China. When we talk about censorship, there is the traditional liberal view of censorship, which basically refers to government censorship. That the government, sort of deletes or uses preventive or punitive means to limit people's speech. That's the traditional liberal view of censorship. Most of current research on the internet censorship in China, I would argue, follows this traditional view, liberal view of censorship. It's a limited view, basically focusing on government as the censor, and government authorities and agencies and institutions as the censors. And the focus, we have a number of very popular, influential studies which show what kind of words are more likely to be censored, right? Dissidents are harassed, and websites blocked, and so on. We know very well this phenomenon. But I'm going to argue that censorship is not exercised only by the state. It may also be exercised by non-state actors and in non-coercive ways. And communication in general may be censored through informal and indirect methods, social norms and ideology. In fact, we may argue that the most effective form of censorship is the absence of censorship, the absence of explicit censorship. It's ideological censorship. It's social norm that prevents people from speaking what they could have spoken, right? And therefore, if we allow that we have this new conception of censorship as a broader view of censorship, then we may argue that the discourse of civility and civilization is part of this new censorship agenda and is used to censor communication in particular ways. When we talk about civility, in general, we think of civility as a norm, civil behavior, uncivil behavior. So there are these debates about the presidential debates becoming more and more uncivil, right? There's American presidential debates. Even there are a lot of also arguments, debates about American society becoming more and more uncivil, and others disagree. So that when we have this kind of debates, the assumption is that civility is a norm. It's a norm for a particular kind of behavior. And this is the traditional view of civility. But we can also think of civility in a different way. And here I'm borrowing an idea from political scientist Susan Herbst, which she develops in Root Democracy, the book Root Democracy, where she argues that we should, in view of the difficulties of resolving whether or not American society is becoming more civil or more uncivil, let's take a different approach to civility and think of civility as a strategic tool for specific purposes. And if we take this view, then we will ask questions like when do presidential candidates use civil or uncivil rhetoric in public debates? And we will understand that incivility, rude remarks, rude talk, rude speech can sometimes have more powerful effect, rhetorical effects than civil discourse. So we can think of civility as a tool or as a technology. And I'm going to use both. We can think of civility as both norm and tool. So now to the discourses, civility and civilization in China. This goes back to the early 20th century, late 19th century, when Chinese intellectuals at that time were really struggling, thinking very hard about modernizing China. So the early efforts to modernize China borrow the language of civilization from the Western discourses. So what Chinese intellectuals at that time advocated Wenming, the Chinese term, Chinese language, Chinese term for civilization, as a national strategy for radical social transformation. So it has a long history of usage of this term Wenming. The Chinese term Wenming can be translated in multiple ways, as civilization, as civil, as civilized, or as civility, all these different ways. So I'm going to make a distinction here. I will translate Wenming as civilization. Wenming as civilization will be viewed as an ideology, civilization as an ideology or as a norm. And Wenming as civility will be viewed as a tool or a technology. Okay. So these two distinctions. Very briefly, the idea of civilization as a new ideology in Reform China is very important. It was first introduced by Deng Xiaoping in 1979 in a speech he made actually to a group of writers and intellectuals in 1979, where he basically said that while we are developing our material civilization, which means economic development, we should also pay attention to spiritual civilization. And by spiritual civilization, he means, he elaborated in a speech next year, 1980, that it refers to not only education, science, culture, but also communist ideas, ideals, beliefs, morality, discipline, revolutionary standpoints, principles, comrade-like relations among people. It's a new set of norms, a new set of ideology, we might argue. It's important that to emphasize that Deng Xiaoping introduced this idea in 1979. That's the beginning of the reform period of China's economic reform and of the Cultural Revolution. And in developing this concept, and then later on in the public discourse using this concept was the idea of spiritual civilization was often used to contrast with the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. Right? Cultural Revolution was the reference point. It was a chaotic time. Now we need to be more civilized. So gradually it becomes a new ideology, and this ideology was also used to displace the earlier ideology of class struggle, normal class struggle. Now we should focus on moral behavior while we focus on economic development. So this whole idea of civilization, first introduced by Deng Xiaoping, has been a key word in Chinese government policies ever since. Every leader since Deng Xiaoping tried to create a new civilization. So Deng Xiaoping's successor was Jiang Zemin. Mr. Jiang added, in addition to spiritual civilization, Mr. Jiang introduced the concept of political civilization. And that actually brought some hope to the intellectuals at the time, because it signaled the possibility of political change, political civilization. Hu Jintao, who succeeded Jiang Zemin, introduced the idea of social civilization, because social civilization meaning more concerned with social justice issues, with social equality issues, because of the increasing social inequality at the time. And the current leader, Xi Jinping, now has proposed, often talked about ecological civilization. So civilization is a major kind of master frame in the official discourse. So it functions as an ideological discourse. But at a more concrete level, especially in the area of social governance, and in our case, internet governance, the women discourse, the discourse of civilization, actually it functions more like a set of technologies. The discourse of civility. Here I'm borrowing literally Foucault's language. So Foucault has technologies of self, technologies of production, technologies of science systems, technologies of power, and we have a parallel for each. So civility as technologies of production, and we can think of the production of hardware and software for civility projects. One very influential example was 2009, the Ministry of Information Technology at the time wanted to introduce a new software called Green Diamond Youth Escort, basically requiring to have all the computers pre-installed with this software. It's a filtering software, supposedly to protect juniors. But later on, it was found that actually also censors political speech, and that project was aborted because of resistance and protest in China and outside of China. But this is the production of software and hardware for the for the sort of projects of civility construction. The ubiquitous of civility discourse is now really ubiquitous. When you in Chinese public spaces, you see this history of using billboards and posters as long history. And now you see this the image on the bottom and the top is about using the web in civil ways, and then when the kind of science about the civil internet, they often typically use green color. So it's green web, clean web, a healthy web is the typical color. When we think about civility as technologies of power, we think of how civility is often associated with, now increasingly associated with law and order, with national security. To be civil is also for the protection of the nation, national security, and for the protection of cultural security. There's also this new concept of cultural security, that Chinese culture needs to be protected from the encroachment of dangerous polluting Western values. And one of the more recent development was the Supreme Court had a legal interpretation where basically it required that people who post information online may face up to 3 years in prison if the posting is viewed more than 5,000 times or retweeted 500 times. That was in 2013, and just soon after this came out, a young man, 16, 17 young man, was arrested because he posted a message, and that message was retweeted more than 500 times, and he was calling for a kind of street protest. The most important part of this civility as a technology is civility as technologies of the self. There are a lot of things I guess I have to rush a little bit. Civility as technologies of self, as self-discipline. We've got to be self-disciplined when we use the web. We've got to be self-disciplined. To be civil is also a healthy way of using web, being healthy. This civil behavior online is also tied to another enduring discourse in Chinese language about citizen quality, 素质. So there's often a discourse in the Chinese scholars, historians, and literary scholars have written a lot about this notion of citizen quality. That there has been a long discourse where the official discourse, at least elite discourse, blames the citizens for having low quality, not well educated, don't understand what democracy is, and therefore China is not ready for democracy because the citizens are of poor quality, especially migrant workers, for instance. So there's a quality education in the school curriculum for a long time. Now, this new kind of online civil behavior is also tied to that kind of citizen quality education. It's also about good manners. It's also about reason, rationality, because a lot of the kind of protest, contentious behavior online is very emotional. So now reason is used to challenge emotional behavior online. You have to manage your emotions. I'll have an example later on. The discourse about civility as technologies of self often appears in its negative form. So, what is uncivil is picked out. What is cruel and barbarian and uneducated. So recently there are this kind of popular practice in some cities to citizens, their neighborhood committees and activities organized to vote about what's the most uncivilized online behavior. So this example is from June 2015 in the Yuexiu district of the city of Guangzhou. According to the votes of the local community, these are the top 10 uncivil online behavior. Spreading rumors and untruthful information, creating, spreading internet viruses, hacking and harassment, cursing, using dirty language in online forums and chat rooms, porn chat, compulsory ads, spinning information online gambling. A lot of things actually we probably are in agreement with that. We also find this kind of behavior uncivil. So there is a lot of discourse about civility and incivility in online spaces, in online forums. And then there are also a lot of what I call pedagogies of civility, ways and methods of teaching civility behavior online. I listed a few examples. There are civility campaigns. Civility campaigns, online civility campaigns have been going on for quite a while. Citizens are selected, model citizens are selected and praised and rewarded for civil behavior, or punished or made an example of for uncivil online behavior. That's another practice. Websites may be selected and as civilized websites. We also there's also another kind of civilized. There are civilized cities, civilized families. There's a whole language about civility, and this has been also adapted to the measurement of online behavior. I highlighted the bottom two because I want to say a little bit more about these two cases. Online civility volunteers is kind of a very interesting new development. These volunteers, they're also known as internet commentators, and they are also known as the 50 Cent Army. Some of you may know. It's anonymous and voluntary commentators who participate in online discussions, and they're, of course, they're supposed to say things that are in support of government agendas, and they will challenge others who are critical of government policies and government leaders. So these are internet commentators. In recent years, there has been a systematic effort there's also a high-level, ministerial level agency called the Civility Office, Chinese Communist Party Civility Office. I mean, that's my rough translation. This office has been organizing national projects to recruit online civility volunteers. And according to one policy document that's published online, actually the government is very explicit about this kind of project. They don't hide this kind of behavior, right? So according to one policy document, around the country, millions of online civility volunteers are to be recruited in the next few years. And these civility volunteers will actively participate in online discourse in order to generate positive energy. There's also actually a system of evaluation of their work and a system of rewards and so on. So it's an institution that is developed from internet commentators. There are also training courses of all sorts, and I'll talk about some training courses later on. So two examples. Let me talk about, more or less focused on the sort of the major points, relatively abstract. But let me give you a couple of concrete examples about how civility is used as a technology of control or censorship or surveillance. This case is about the Xia Junfeng. Xia Junfeng was a street peddler. So he, street peddler and their conflicts with the law enforcement authorities in China is one of the major causes of online protests, because there are endless this kind of conflicts, and then in number of cases, very prominent, high-profile cases. Whenever such a case happens, in this case, Xia Junfeng in conflict with law enforcement, it's called urban or city inspectors, Chengguan. They have a pretty notorious kind of reputation. In conflict with the city inspectors, he killed two of them. He killed them, and he was arrested and sentenced to death. But as in many other similar cases, the public actually was in sympathy with the street peddler, not with the police, law enforcement authorities. The outpourings, there were a lot of discussions about that they want Xia Junfeng to be pardoned and so on, but he was executed. In 2000, he was executed in 2013, if I remember correctly. A few years after he was arrested and sentenced. So this case happened a week after he was executed. A week after he was executed, his widow, according to Chinese tradition, is the time of memorial. So his widow basically posted messages on Weibo saying that he had died unjustly, and he posted, Zhang Jing, or her name was Zhang Jing, posted a picture on her Weibo, and got a lot of supporting messages. People were outpouring of sympathy for her, and cries of injustice in this case. Again, the sympathy was still with Xia Jifeng and with Zhang Jing. And this is the typical kind of turn of events for a number of years in the past. But in this case, it was different from the past because soon after people began to pour sympathetic remarks for her, there was a countercurrent. There were many others who began to challenge her, first saying that this photograph that she tweeted was not her husband's photograph. And she acknowledged that was true. This was another street peddler who also sentenced to death. But because, I don't know for what reason, maybe she couldn't find a photograph of her husband, she posted this one. This one, other people said she deliberately posted this one because this young man was very emotional, he was crying, and she was trying to use this photograph to arouse people's emotions, to arouse people's sympathy. So this was the kind of counter discourse that was generated against her, and she was very quickly put on the defensive. And this is something relatively new in terms of the internet protest activity, because in the past there were similar cases, and the sympathy was always overwhelmingly on the side of the weak. And in the discourse challenging her and challenging her sympathizers, typically people say, you are too emotional, you got to use reason, be rational, right? And so according to, there are also critical discourses critical of this kind of discourse. And one person charged that a lot of this critical discourse came from the internet commentators, anonymous internet commentators, who are supportive of the government. But government media, official media, was also doing the same thing. So there's one editorial on Chinese Central TV website, which editorial about this case, which it basically says, I will quote a passage from the editorial. In the face of those excessively emotion-stirring words or fanatic stories, net friends, internet friends, should reduce their impulsive participation by 30%. So Chinese internet culture is very participatory and emotional participation. But here is the clear advice about 30% less of impulsive participation. Be more calm, more rational, and not just becoming filled with indignation and anger like others. So it's the use of the discourse of civility, reason, to challenge the discourse of emotion, indignation, anger, and so on. So emotional becomes irrational, becomes uncivil, is to be eradicated. This is a very interesting case, and there's a lot of debates on both sides. And it's relatively a new development. A question related to this is, people sometimes ask, why would people volunteer to support the government, right? Why would people want to be recruited into civility volunteers? A number of things I wanted to emphasize. As I mentioned, that the government is not does not hide anything. It's very, very explicit. Actually, made it very public. This is one ceremony in Shanxi province. Literally means the launching ceremony of youth civility Internet Civility volunteers in Shanxi province. So it's a public ceremony to inaugurate the use of Civility volunteer. But I want to mention a few points. First, not all volunteers, online volunteers, internet commentators are voluntary. Sometimes kind of there are very strategic and powerful efforts to recruit young people by local government agencies. But I also want to emphasize, this question came up in the class before this, I also wanted to emphasize that these volunteers may not necessarily be manipulated by government officials. They're not necessarily blind followers. Sometimes they're happily doing this. They really volunteer. That's another kind of part of the story. A third reason is sometimes people just go along. This is another government campaign. If the government need to recruit a certain number of volunteers, and I need to be part of the volunteer, I'll just do it, right? It's like, and because China has a history of campaigns, people deal with campaigns in a cool way, right? So just another campaign. The last point I think needs a special emphasis, which is an interesting development of the Chinese cyber culture, is that we now see more and more polarization in Chinese online spaces, and liberal discourse is often challenged by a different kind of discourse. You might call it nationalistic discourse or patriotic discourse. There is a kind of a social movement, which is a nationalistic movement, both online and offline, very critical of Western practices and Western values and so on. So there are, in that sense, a lot of these volunteers, online civility volunteers, are doing this in a genuine way to challenge discourses that are critical of government behavior and government policies. Next example is about the training courses for managing online crises. Government agencies at all levels, from the top to the bottom, to the township levels, are nowadays very much concerned with these kind of contentious activities online. So whenever something happens, there's a kind of online crisis. A lot of energies now are put into managing these crises. It often happens that government officials may not be the most savvy users of internet. They do not necessarily actually understand very well internet culture, and therefore nowadays there are a lot of training programs that target government agencies and government officials to train them to how to make appropriate responses when a crisis or a protest event happens online. Because sometimes the inappropriate response backfires and makes the protest escalate. So now it's like a major industry, training courses by business firms, but also by government agencies. Like People's Daily runs this professional training course for internet opinion analysts, sort of very similar to the internet commentators, for a number of years. And sorry, this is in Chinese, but I'll translate this for you. For a training course lasting for 4 days, from May 25th to May 29th this year, you need to pay a training fee of 3,981 yuan. Training fee. You need to pay another fee, miscellaneous fee of 3,820 yuan, and then you need to pay out 2,000 yuan for food and accommodation for only 4 or 5 days of training program. And then on the other side is the diploma of training diploma that people receive after the training course. And then there are kind of nowadays online public opinion survey reports which are produced by a number of major research institutions in China, which are used as textbooks for training government officials. But it's also a business, and business firms also train other business firms how to. It's a PR strategy, how to respond to online crisis, negative online discourse. So this is from one website, a training company that trains people how to manage online public opinion. I have some brief translations in the middle of this. So if you take a look at the left side, detailed procedures for firms to manage internet. 舆情means public opinion. Strengthen the routine monitoring and elevate it to the institutional level. You've got to make it a priority of your firm. And then there are also different procedures for big firms and for small firms, different things you might do for different firms. And there's also very specific advice about set on the right-hand side, set up a team of internet spokespersons and YouTube commentators who have a very clear set of duties and requirements, responsibilities, and there are 4 methods for channeling internet opinion: persuasion with reason, overwhelm with power. If you can't persuade with reason, then use power. Change topic, disrupt the topic. These are being taught to government officials and to business executives. Sort of ostensibly to make the Chinese web a more civilized space, but also it's a new form of censorship, I would argue. And it's also a major business involving huge money. What are the consequences of this civility and civilization discourse for internet governance? So this is like summing up very briefly. I try to argue that civility has become a new institution for censorship with a set of norms, with bureaucratic organizations. Like at the top, there's a civility office, and very specific methods. And then with millions of civility volunteers now monitoring the web, it seems that we can argue that the boundaries between surveillance and censorship have become very blurred. We often, we talk about surveillance, the whole series of seminars is surveillance, but can we think of surveillance as a form of censorship? More general, at least in this case, it seems that surveillance has become a form of censorship because it's all the civility volunteers are watching all the time, right? You know that they are watching, and therefore you'll be careful what you're talking about. And that's a form of effective censorship. And in that sense, surveillance without explicit or coercive censorship may be censorship at its most effective. And then we may also generalize, make the point that if surveillance has become censorship, then censorship is now just as ubiquitous as surveillance. So this is sort of more general conclusion. I see we have very little time left, and I want to leave some time for Q&A. I do have a couple of more slides about resistance, which I'll mention very briefly. I'm not saying that this civility discourse and ideology, methods, pedagogy of teaching and training how to cultivate civility has been all powerful and effective. There's always resistance, and I want to mention a few examples. Resistance continues. And one very interesting, remarkable example was 2009 campaign. There was a national campaign, and the campaign was called Anti-Vulgarity Campaign, which is a campaign to crack down on online porn and lewd content, vulgar content. So one way that Chinese netizens try to challenge this kind of campaign is to because of the campaign, a lot of the masterpieces of world art, nude art, were taken offline. Right? It's not appropriate content for website. And therefore, some creative people dressed up the nude figures and then put up a lot of these if you search. And the grass mud lexicon, the whole grass mud lexicon was coined and developed and spread in that period. And because of this kind of really parody, political parody and satire. The entire campaign, I think, really failed. It was an effective case of resistance. That was before 2013. There is also kind of hypocrisy in the use of the civility discourse. Civility discourse often challenges emotional discourse, but the government sometimes also try to win over people through emotional kind of language. This happened this year in June 2015 when cruise capsized on Yangtze River. A lot of people, over 400 people, died because of this. Unlike in previous cases, in this time the web on Weibo was relatively, not as critical, not as contentious as before, because all these major government agencies and media channels were generating positive energy. And what kind of positive energy was being generated? This is one example. After a while, some people posted top 10 mass media titles about this incident. The top 10 most disgusting titles, titles of news stories. Number one is, on ground zero, China's most handsome men are all there. So this is about the relief efforts. All the media attention was about positive energy, right? So it's about the handsome men the people were trying to save, but not about the victims, not about their families. And then there are also even some such language, how fortunate to be born Chinese, because the government is helping everybody. And then the challenging discourse. The challenging discourse is, the third example is challenging. To be supportive of government is supposed to be rational, but why is it rational to be supportive of the government? So this is a kind of interesting interaction between the kind of positive energy and negative energy in online discourse, and the civility, hypocrisy of civility. And another recent example is the Tianjin explosion, major explosion. And after the local media in Tianjin was completely almost quiet. And the Weibo, which has been very quiet for a number of years, suddenly exploded with energy, this time with negative energy, very critical. So I'm suggesting here there are contingencies like disasters, earthquakes, which will suddenly wake people, the stagnant, wake up the web, and contention can happen in very powerful ways again. So this is kind of what I'm suggesting, that there are always possibilities of resisting, challenging the discourse of civility and government. Thank you. I'll stop here.